Hey everybody, Daryl with Sinister Speed Co here in Penticton, BC. So today I just want to do a quick tutorial again on the Wilbers Nivomat LDC setups that we're promoting here at Sinister Speed Co. We feel like we've found a suspension setup for the Harley Davidson baggers for the majority of the riders out there that don't necessarily want the big name, the big known names in their performance bagger or their their comfort touring setup. So luckily we've been able to align ourselves with Wilbers performance suspension out of Germany, and we've got a pretty unique opportunity here to kind of change the way that I think Harley riders think about suspension, the advantages of it, and really where we can go with this. It's kind of endless at this point. I know it's not a really well-known brand, but we're about to change everybody's mind on that. So for the last 6 weeks, we've been doing some testing with the Wilbers LDC Nivomat shock setup and their fork spring setup. So when Wilbers originally shipped me this stuff, we got it. I was very skeptical, obviously, because I, like everybody else, have only heard about all the other brands, Legends and Oleans and, RWD and all these guys that are big players in the Harley market in North America here. So the beautiful thing about what Wilbers has done is they've taken a great suspension setup, and they have, of course, being a German company, engineered the snot out of it and given us an opportunity to not only have a performance bagger setup that is extremely comfortable, but it performs far better than I ever imagined it would. And you never have to adjust it. So you install it, or we install it here at Sinister Speed Co. We set it up for the rider weight, and then you never have to touch it again. So what ends up happening is if you switch from solo riding to two-up riding, you end up with having to make no adjustments. The left-hand shock on this bike actually will pump itself back up, so you never lose your original setting. So it's pretty amazing stuff. I can charge corners the same solo riding as I can two-up riding. The bike doesn't lose any ground clearance, it handles the same, it acts the same, has the same amount of traction, same lean angles, everything. So it realistically is an amazing setup if you're after a performance bagger setup, or if you're just a touring rider that's looking for comfort. It does both, and it does both extremely well. I would put it up against anything on the market in the performance bagger world. It handles and does everything that those suspensions that are tailored for the performance bagger setup are doing. So just a quick little bit of info. Sorry about the mess in the shop. I got a bunch of projects on the go here and it's a bit messy. So obviously the big brains of the system is this left-hand shock. It is where all the thinking is done. This shock is the one that does all the adjustments. So the right-hand shock is just a standard, looks like your standard, touring shock. It's got adjustable preload on it, so you can set your rider sag for the bike and your weight as a solo rider. And then this shock on this side actually does all the adjustments. So as you, say, increase your rate of travel, the road conditions adjust, so you go from, say, straight roads to twisties, and you start pushing the bike and you really want to get into it and lean the bike over and do the this thing basically adjusts real time. It's got a bunch of really cool technology in it that accommodates all sorts of riding conditions. You go from nice smooth pavement to maybe some choppy beat up pavement. Here in the southern part of BC, we're pretty fortunate. We don't get a lot of really, frost heaved roads or a lot of rough pavement. But when we do, this stuff adjusts for it. Now, if you ride, say, on the prairies where they get a lot of frost heaved highways and stuff, this stuff will just gobble those frost heaves up and really help you with your ride. Obviously a massive improvement from the factory suspension, which is what everybody's after. You're after comfort, you're after handling. The other thing is the Streetglides come with a 12-inch shock from factory. That 12-inch shock really, gives the bike a cool low slung look, but it also gives a lot of riders some extra added confidence because you are dealing with a 12-inch shock. So riders in parking lots or, situations where they have to back out, maybe on a gravel, parking lot or whatever, gives you a lot of confidence because the bike is a little lower in the back and you can move the bike around easier that way. Whereas, say, the Streetglide Specials or the Roadglide Specials have the 13-inch shocks. Now, the difference in the factory 12 and 13-inch shocks to any aftermarket shock, and I'm focusing solely on the Wilbers here because Sinister Speed Co. is gonna have this as our signature suspension system. I'm gonna get to the front forks in a minute because I think that's really where the magic starts to happen as well on our setups. We've done some testing and changed things up from what Wilbers does. So the aftermarket shocks, in your head you're thinking, okay, well I've bought a 13-inch shock now for my Roadglide, Streetglide, and I'm worried about my ground clearance. Well, the difference between an aftermarket shock and the factory shocks is your factory shocks, when you tip the bike off the stand and you sit on it, that factory shock doesn't move. So if you buy a factory 13-inch shock and you're used to a 12-inch shock, you're essentially going to lose that 1 inch. Where if you're challenged in the inseam like I am, you're going to lose that inch. So you're going to be tiptoeing around parking lots, gravel and stuff. You're going to slip. You're going to have a tough time moving your bike around. An aftermarket shock, any shock is supposed to have 1/3 of the stroke of it is supposed to be sag. And the reason for that is so then on compression, the shock has 2 inches of travel, but on rebound, it has 1 inch to move too. Then you get a full range of motion within the shock, whereas the stock Harley-Davidson shocks are always topped out, so you have no rebound movement. You have zero movement up. So the only time those shocks really work is when you hit something big, the shock will actually compress. So don't be scared of 13-inch shocks, because a 13-inch aftermarket shock, by the time you add your sag into it, you're back down to a proper 12-inch shock, but you still get 2 inches of travel. Whereas, down and then the inch up. So you end up with essentially 3 inches of travel. The stock Harley-Davidson 13-inch shocks certainly have more compression travel than the 12-inch shocks do. I think the 12-inch shocks are somewhere around 1 5/8 inches, maybe 1 3/4 inches. Well, at least with our Wilbers shocks or any 13-inch shock, you're going to end up closer to 3 inches of travel, which is immediately going to change the way your bike feels, rides, and handles. It's definitely going to be a lot more comfortable. So don't be scared to give me a call and discuss the technology behind these Wilbers LDC Nivomat shocks. They're incredible. I come from a background of motocross, supercross, endurocross, and I did suspension for years for everybody from grassroots riders right up to pros. And I was always a big fan of making sure that shocks had as much adjustment in them as you can get. So high speed and low speed compression, rebound adjustment, length adjustment. Like, I wanted to be able to fine tune those and tinker with them as much as possible. So these shocks weirded me out only because there's no adjustment on them other than preload. And so I'm a tinker guy. I got to be able to dial this stuff in. So these shocks do exactly what Wilbers says and more. Don't take my word for it. Go buy a set. Give me a call, buy a set, put them on your bike. If you're not satisfied with them, we'll work something out, because these are amazing. I can push corners hard. I can ride nicely down the highway. It does everything that I need it and more. Now on to the forks. So what Wilbers does is, Wilbers in the LDC Nivomat kit, is Wilbers sends you a set of progressive zero friction fork springs. And what they've done is they've designed those fork springs and their proprietary oils. Everybody seems to have a proprietary oil. But what Wilbers has done is they actually still use the factory damper rods. So massive improvement over the stock spring setup in the Harley Davidsons, because Harley Davidson is notoriously soft and spongy on their fork setups. Now what that does in the fork setup is when you have input in your bars and you want to turn, you put that input in, then the forks will be spongy. They create a lot of wallow, we call it in the moto world. So what you end up doing is you put your input into the bike, then the forks compress, and then the bike actually moves. So you end up with a delay. It's a lazy feel on the bike, which for a lot of guys, they get comfortable with that. They've become accustomed to the Harley Davidson spongy front end, and they just don't react quickly. And it is comfortable. I mean, you can get lazy on the bike. You can be cruising with your hand off the one grip, and you know, you hit something and it just kind of wallows around, and it's this lazy feel. So what Wilbers has done is they send you these beautiful progressive springs, the fork oil and stuff, you put it in there, massive improvement immediately. The only bad part about continuing to use the factory damper rod is as the fork compresses, the ports that the oil has to get shoved through, these little ports in the damper rod, there's no change in those. So the harder and faster you hit something, the harder it is for the oil to flow through those. So you end up with a harshness to the front fork. The handling is greatly improved. The bike stays up a little higher in the front end when you charge corners. So your lean angles are improved. The bike is more flickable, so when you put steering input in, it reacts quickly because the forks don't have to like wallow out and give you this spongy, lazy feeling before the bike actually reacts to your input. So the bike becomes far more flickable. So you end up with a sportier feel, yet it still gobbles up all that stuff on the highway. So the increase in spring rate actually doesn't affect the ride negatively at all. It actually just does nothing but improve it. And the way that they create their progression on those fork springs is also a massive improvement over the Harley Davidson progression on the springs. So that setup we tested for about 3 weeks, and I really quite liked it. The problem was, like I say, the faster or harder you hit something, the harsher it is. So what ends up happening is you get this real, if you hit something quickly, you get this real jar in the front bars because the oil can't flow through those ports quick enough. So what I did in this fork setup was I messed around with some valving. So I did some modifications to the damper rod to basically make the damper rods unusable. Now they're just pipes. The oil flows through them freely. But then I added a PD valve on the top of those damper rods, and what that does is creates a valving system for me. So it's a valving system that essentially allows the oil to flow over a larger surface area, which changes with the changing road systems, just like a cartridge would if you were to put a cartridge system in there. So it now has valving, albeit it's not adjustable from outside on the forks like a cartridge would be. It still creates a valving system in there. So what it does is it gives us greater control of the oil flow. It also gives us the opportunity to that when we are low speed, the forks are really nice and compliant. So in parking lots, you know, low speed stuff around town, it's a really nice plush, soft feel. But as our you know, ground speed increases, that valving system becomes more and more effective, because the faster that oil has to flow through that valving system, the more the valving system works. So that PD valve added into this fork now took all the harshness out of the, the higher speed stuff. It made the bike even more flickable, so it reacts even quicker now to steering input and so on. But it's extremely plush and just eats up everything on the highway. The one thing I did notice is now I get more feedback from the highway, or the road surface. So now I can feel what's going on the road surface. So when I go barreling into a corner and it's a tight winder where I'm just about dragging my highway pegs, I get into that corner and I lean, I can feel what the front tire is gripping on. I can feel if there's gravel or sand on the road. I can feel if the pavement is changing. And so I can search for that grip if I need to. I can be leaned right out, 70 miles an hour in a corner, and I can change lanes in that corner, no problem, with just the tiniest bit of steering input. So it gives me, I feel like it's a better match and a better balance for the way Wilbers has created the rear shock system. Now I have a better balance with my front end. So the front end is now caught up to the rear end. So now what I end up with is a performance bagger setup that you'd never know is a performance bagger setup. I don't wheelie my bagger, but I would give this to somebody if they wanted to wheelie it, and I'd have no problem with the way that fork is set up. It will handle that sort of abuse. I like to charge corners. This thing now stands up even better in the front end than it did before. I have more control. But what it also does is I don't have the performance bagger look. I love the way my bagger looks. And so this is kind of almost sneaky, because now nobody knows what I'm running in there, but the feel that it gives me is incredible. So I can charge corners with this, I can play with this thing, I can do rolling burnouts, I can do all the things that I want to do with this bike. But yet when I'm cruising down the highway, this is the most comfortable ride I've ever had in a bagger. So I feel like our testing has paid off. My years of experience and suspension knowledge in the moto world, I've transferred that into the forks on this. And I can basically put that system in your forks for about half what a cartridge would cost. So if you're not interested in spending the big dollars on the cartridge and tinkering with clickers all the time on the top, this will save you a bunch of money, get you into a performance bagger setup with comfort, handling, and I don't compromise the fact that I've got a shorter inseam, so when I'm in a parking lot I can still move my bike around, no problem. But like I say, I pick up a passenger, I don't care if that passenger is 120 pounds or 220 pounds, this thing will adjust for it and still handle the same as it did before, aside from the fact that you've got added weight on the bike. But I think we've come up with a good signature setup for the forks. Sinister Speedgo is pretty proud of the testing we've done. I've had these forks off and on my bike in the last 6 weeks, no less than 6 times. And I think I've found the sweet spot to where this system is now balanced. So give us a call here at Sinister Speedco. We do suspension. We obviously do some kick-ass apparel. Give me a call, we'll hook you up. Just so you know, at the end of March, the prices on the LDC Nivomat is going up, so we're trying to do a big stock order, make sure we've got the stock in at the reduced pricing. So give us a call, message me down below, follow the page, like the page, tell all your homies. Let's change the way people look at bagger suspension here, and give it a shot. Give me a call and talk about it. I think it's worth your time. Cheers, guys.